Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Centric. This being a show, we're talking about crime dramas that I watch. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Prodigal Son. A great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I really like how we structured this episode because I thought it was kind of interesting because at first it's like, okay, this was yesterday, this was last night, and then we get to 12 hours later. I was like, wait, later? I thought we were going to go 12 hours before to kind of get to where we got there, but it's like, no, we kind of start sort of we're at the end and go further into the end, and then we rewind throughout the end. I love the way this episode was structured in that regard. So obviously we have like Bright being interviewed by a psychologist sent by Internal Affairs because he's interviewing not only Bright but Gil, Adrisa, Danny, and JT to try and see whether or not, and Malcolm as well, to figure out whether he's, in the right state of mind, because obviously this is so soon after everything that went down last episode, being kidnapped and everything that he went through, that obviously, Malcolm being who he is, he needs to be, working to kind of make himself, it's what he does. He has to work. And so he ends up talking to the psychologist, Simon Copenrath, so we'll just refer to him as Simon, and they try to kind of piece this whole thing together along with the case, because it turns out like Malcolm did something so crazy and wild as something known as the incident. So it's like, what was this incident? Well, we're slowly unveiling this because I love different people, because obviously like the person who's probably the most concerned is probably Gil and Danny, because Danny, and it's even something that came up later on because Jessica herself says it, of like, Danny, you might be the closest thing that he has to a really close friend. And it's like, yeah, and I think that's something Malcolm's kind of going his entire life never really having like a friend, just considering it, and to have Danny as that. And even JT was like, oh yeah, it was wild, he was uncontrollable. I say this as a friend, which like JT says it reluctantly, but even JT would consider Malcolm a friend, probably more so, but like in front of Malcolm's face it's like we're associates, behind his back we're friends. But regardless, I thought it was really interesting. Obviously, like, Gil wants Malcolm not on his case at all. It's like, how did Gil feel about you being on a case? He was so excited. No, hard cut to him saying, no, Malcolm, you're not on a case. But then, like, Danny dropping him off, the whole conversation about the different jellos and stuff. And his mom's hired someone to kind of make sure that he stays in bed and stuff. And, regardless, obviously, because Danny's like, obviously Malcolm hasn't really talked about it, but obviously he's been through a lot. And obviously she finds out about a case, and obviously Malcolm overhears, slips away and joins the case. And they're like, really? What are you doing here? And I love that everyone, and he was like, well, the fact of the matter, it's like, I'm always needed, just not always wanted by everyone. But lo and behold, who gives him the best warming introduction, happy to see you, is Adrisa. Dude, Adrisa's my spirit animal. I adore her so much, dude. I get giddy every time she's on screen, just because of like her bubbly personality, but also just how excited and ecstatic she gets around Malcolm. It's so adorable. She's like, oh my God, Malcolm. She's like, right. The fact is, all those wounds and stuff like that. Look at you. You still look great. And then she looks, and the entire team's looking at her. She's like, okay, I might have taken, a look at his file or whatever. And it's like, it was super sweet. It's just because she wanted to make sure he was okay and everything. I was like, oh, that's adorable. But obviously there's this victim. They didn't know his name at the time, but his name was Tristan. There's these like burn marks of some sort around his head, and he had strangle marks on his neck, like he had been strangled. And obviously, there was the whole, like, I love the whole thing of, like, well, then how did, and, Simon asked, well, how did Malcolm find out about the autopsy? And you have Adrisa being like, because I told him. I mean, like, basically she's gushing, being like, Malcolm's so amazing because he was able to figure this all out and stuff like that. But she also adds this little line of, like, I also told him because, I miss seeing him. And she's like, oh, don't write that down. And she's got a smile on her face when she's saying that because it's a nervous. I'm like, once again, it's like, Adrisa is so awesome, dude. I love it. The actress who plays her, she just brings such an adorableness. I think the actress's name, I'm going to butcher her last name. It's something with an A, but I think her first name is Keiko. It's like, she brings such an adorableness to that character. I love it so much. I even love it later. Oh, my other favorite Adrisa moment. And she's like, wow, Malcolm did that? He's such a nut job. But you gotta love him. And I'm like, you're so adorable, Adrisa. You're too damn adorable. But basically it turns into a situation of, the basically everything leads them to this group known as the Volsler Institute, and they're interestingly enough, the Volsler is played by Daniel. Is it? I'm always forgetting his last name, but most recent thing he's been in is Manifest. But you see him in so many different things, so it's just interesting because he plays Danny on Manifest. So I just thought that was just interesting to me. But regardless, he runs this kind of institute that kind of is a little bit cultish, and I love JT being like, "Oh, this doesn't seem like a cult." And then they talk to Vossler for a little bit, and it's like JT's like, "All right, I see the cult vibes." So obviously they weren't getting anywhere on that front because it's like, well, you want to get information, well, you have to sign off these, you have warrants and stuff like that. Well, Bright, decides to take it upon himself to infiltrate the group, and he signs up the stuff to make it seem like, oh, he's the most in desperate need of all this. So it's like, oh, let me sign up, let me start now. And then it's kind of like this shock therapy of, and it's like, obviously, like, people want to do plastic surgery to change their bodies. Volster is like, I want to give, electricity to kind of make people be able to change their mind, because it is a combination of, like, obviously Malcolm's still not dealing with what he's going through, but he's seeing stuff. And even Simon's like, yeah, like, you were staring off even, during this conversation we had. What did you see? Because even, Danny had talked about the fact is at the, where the body was found and everything, Bright got paler than usual, and he was just kind of a little more off. He was, something just wasn't quite right. And the thing is that he kept seeing, Malcolm kept seeing himself as a kid dead, because he keeps remembering everything he was told last episode. Your dad tried to murder you. He was planning to kill you. And that becomes a psychological thing in itself, which we'll get to that soon enough. But I love that, obviously, Malcolm also did all this because it turns out, like, I love that conversation between him and Simon, because he brings up the whole fact is that, like, Malcolm and trauma. And I love that Malcolm brings up the conversation that the reason why he does what he does, why cases are so important to him, is because he doesn't do them for himself. He does it for the victims. Because for him, he was like, I was in that circumstances. I was in a case, that being his dad's situation. And he was like, because I didn't see my dad for who he was, because I didn't solve this case, so many people died. And it's kind of sad that he takes that upon himself. That it's psychologically, from a psychological standpoint, that he looks at himself as like, if I had solved that case, so many people would still be alive. But it's like, you were a kid at the time, like, you wouldn't be able to kind of done anything. But the fact is, he looks at himself like that, and that's what he treats every case like. He doesn't care if he has to put himself in a situation like, it's like he put himself in that situation to be electrocuted and stuff like that, just to kind of lay low, to be, to kind of get close, to kind of solving this case and stuff like that. But he's willing to do whatever, because it's not about me, it's about the victims, like in this case Tristan, and obvious victim, and prevent future victims like Andy. And I thought that was such an interesting perspective to understand Malcolm even more. And there's even this line he says later on that I really enjoyed, that what was it again? That he himself is trauma. I mean, and I'd say like, but I don't mean it like that. But it was such an interesting insight to his character, that he looks at himself as like trauma, because he says, because of that, like me being trauma, I can understand the human condition. It makes me very good at my job, and that shouldn't be a hindrance. It actually should make me more, because he's been through such trauma, and he can understand, like, almost basically be empathetic to understanding the human mind on such a level. It can make him get inside of people's head a lot easier. Like, obviously you can look at that from a pessimistic point of view of like, oh, you're very good at getting inside of a serial killer's head. That says a lot about you. But at the same time, it says, because you've gone through a trauma of your own, you can understand someone else's trauma, being empathetic. Like, there's a level of empathy in all of that, that I think is so fascinating to kind of get that being another element to his character with all of this. But I really thought it was kind of nice, Malcolm tried to get Andy out, because Andy, she's kind of been through the program, like she's going through those sessions like 18 times, and it turns out Tristan was actually the one that brought her into the program and everything, because obviously, she's like, oh, I come from like, a cliche thing of like, well, kind of crappy parents, but Malcolm tried to make her realize like, how'd you felt, you felt kind of alone and trapped with those crappy parents. how do you feel now? You feel the same, don't you? So you don't need to be here. That basically every time you felt like getting out every single time you're going through those sessions and stuff like that. But for her, the whole program's got her scared of like potentially leaving and stuff like that. So, but Malcolm is able to kind of convince her, but sadly she gets taken. And obviously Malcolm got pissed off because he thought, Vessler was behind it, but it turns it's not. It's deprogrammers who are behind all of this. And it's interesting as they try to like figure out who these, try to figure out the whole deprogrammer situation. So they go through a long list of people using Jessica, her connections and stuff like that. And they're interviewing them to kind of get to know all of them to see like whether there's signs there. And I love at one point Jessica saying like, yeah, like is using the example being like, yeah, why don't you just, talking about, I guess like trying to say like her son or whatever is in a cult or whatever. And she says a line of, why don't you just, take the inheritance money, settle down and pop out a few grandkids. And then as she's saying that, she kind of turns and looks at Malcolm and Malcolm kind of stares back at her like, okay, Mom, I get the hint that you're trying to lay out there. So I just thought that was kind of adorable. I even love that moment of like, Simon's interviewing her, but it also shows you just how much of a big personality that Jessica does. That like, even though she's the one being interviewed, she's actually doing the interviewing. I think it's kind of interesting, which is almost a little foreshadowing when you think about it. But once again, that's just me looking too much into it. But Simon was like, wait, so why did you do this? And she's like, oh, because of Gil. It's like, I like, being in a situation where people kind of owe me. And it's like, but don't you want to talk about my son's mental health? And he's like, right. What do you think? She's like, I think you should fire him immediately. But until then, I'll help him with all his little cases. It's so interesting that even in moments like that, Jessica feels like she's always in control. Like I said, it's just she has such a big personality and she just has such a big presence. I think it's just amazing. I don't know, that she's got like this powerful ass charisma about her. I don't know what to really how to really put it into words. But obviously they ended up finding their guy. His name was Curtis, but everything looks like it points to him being the one that kidnapped Andy. But obviously it didn't sit well with Malcolm because it's like Curtis is most likely, he's the muscle. For whoever this deprogrammer is, it has to be someone that's pretty smart. It has to be someone who's pulling the strings from a mental standpoint to kind of be able to understand the mind enough to deprogram someone. So it's like he feels like there's more to this, but Gil's like, the fact of the matter is you need to kind of walk away from this case. And it's like, look at the way you are, especially when you're like the way you are right now. And then Malcolm kind of snaps. He's like, the way I am right now is because of you. It's because of the no, he would say that it was because of it's because of Martin Whitley. It's because of God, I'm blanking on his name already. The killer from last episode. His fake name was Paul, but I'm blanking what his real name was. If something was a J, right? Oh, I'm blanking on it. I'll know afterwards, but it's like he was blaming him as well, but then he was also like, it's also your fault, Gil. And Gil's almost like, wait, what? He's like, because you knew I wasn't in the right mind state. You asked me for help with the first case. You knew what dragging me back into all of this would mean, bringing me back into this. And, it's all, this is all on you. And obviously, Gil was hurt by this. He was like, get the hell out of my precinct. Because Gil, obviously, he cares about Malcolm. Like, every turn and every step, he's always telling Malcolm, like, no, don't. But at the same time, even during the interviews and stuff like that, Gil kind of admits, like, he doesn't want to let Malcolm go because Malcolm's really good at his job and he gets results and they're able to stop bad people. They're able to save a lot of people's lives because of that. But at the same time, it's just because of everything that Malcolm's going through right now. He's spiraling, and just because I think everything with his dad in his mind and what he learned last episode, he was just kind of pissed at Gil. He needed to lash out at somebody else because he's lashing at himself. And obviously, Danny saw across the room like, okay, something's wrong. And she that moment of panic in her, like when she's chasing after Malcolm, he locks himself in the room with those electrodes and he's about to electrocute himself. And so then we kind of like come full circle with everything to understand. And I love that moment of, Simon being like, tell me what it is that what are you running from? And it's like, what I was told last episode. And it's like, well, what did he tell you? He told me that my dad was going to kill me. And this was a good line I love of like, because Simon was like, well, you already knew your dad was a psychopath, like, so why, it's almost like, why is that much of a thing? Like, why is that an issue? Like, knowing that your dad potentially was going to kill you, you know he's killed a lot of people, so what makes this different? And Malcolm explained that from that the logical side of his brain of like, yeah, like my studying, like the way my brain works, the psychology side of my brain, it's like, of course he would do that. But there's a part of him, the kid that's still inside of him, that believes like, despite the monster his dad was, my dad still loved me. But now that love is brought into question, because it's like, if he was willing to kill me, like, then, you know, there was still some, so that's why I think he still was able to bring himself to turn to his dad when he needed help. You know, just because he's able to trying to separate by being like, professionally, I need Martin Whitley's help. But there's a part of him that's still that kid that's like, that's still my dad. And on some level, he thought maybe my dad still loved me. But now it brings out this part of him realizing like, that's innocence that was there is gone. And now it manifested itself as him as a 10-year-old dad, because his dad killed, basically learning that truth that his dad was trying to kill him, manifested itself as that innocent 10-year-old him that held on to that fact that he thought his dad loved him. And obviously he, you know, it went away obviously during Volsler's sessions with him, but it came back and he was going to electrocute himself. And obviously because of this time, I was like, all right, I'm gonna have to kick you off the case. I'm gonna tell you, before this, the commercial break that happens after that, and before the reveal and everything, that's where it clicked in my head. I was like, you are the mastermind, aren't you? You're the deprogrammer. Because it's the way he kept prodding like so much at Malcolm at that point, made me kind of go like, okay, maybe there's something here. But then it made me also look back in retrospect. Remember how he exploded when he was so upset when he found out about what Volsler's doing. It's like, oh, like the fact of the matter is, from a psychological standpoint, you should do this, and this before you even get to like electrode stuff like that. That should be something you jump to immediately. You have to check off a whole bunch of boxes, go through a whole bunch of procedures before you even get to that. That's not where you start off at. So at first it seemed like, oh, maybe just from a professional standpoint it pissed him off. But now in retrospect, I was like, that's why he was so pissed. As a deprogrammer, it would make so much sense. And I was like, holy crap. I thought that was so fascinating. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, I got it. You're the deprogrammer. And then after the commercial break, Malcolm lays it out, because it's like, oh, Andy, I never told you that Andy was a lady. Because even I didn't piece it together, because I didn't notice her name tag the first time until after he said like, oh yeah, people like Andy. And then it came back to him telling Andy like, yo, we need to get out of here. I guess I caught bits and pieces like, oh, that's who, because I was looking at her names. I was like, oh, I guess her name's Andy, because he never did ever specify that Andy was a lady. So it's like, interesting. So it started kind of falling into place. And, you know, I was like, oh, this was like a well-constructed trap. It's like literally the entire day, me and my entire team have had our eyes on you. He's like, your team, they think you're just as crazy, which, yeah, there's some truth. Yes, they've had some concerns and stuff like that, but still, despite everything, they've got Malcolm's back. And I just thought, I don't know, I just thought that was just so good. Like I said, it's just like how well executed that all was. I thought was pretty impressive. The entire time, Simon thinks he's building a case against building something against Malcolm, when in fact Malcolm's been the one in control the entire time, playing, maneuvering, knowing what little breadcrumbs to kind of put out there that kind of make himself weak enough to feel like Simon can jump on him and try and push and pry. And when he thinks he has Malcolm so vulnerable, it's when Malcolm strikes. It's like, it was such a well executed plan, and I love that. I even love him being like, okay, you got it all figured out, but did you see this coming? And points a gun at Malcolm. I was like, honestly, I didn't see that coming. But it was even sadder because we look back and like kind of understand, like, because the whole conversation about like, oh, what do you know about trauma is what Malcolm had told him. And he talked about his little girl, Lily, his daughter. And the fact is, the last time they spent any time together, he was saying because he looked away at one point in time trying to change the radio, car flipped and she died on impact. Well, now in retrospect, you know, well, that was how it was initially presented, but now Malcolm presents it as like the reason why you go so above and beyond, because it turns out Andy was like the main person he was hired to get. He only went through Tristan, but things went too far because Curtis was you know, because he was Simon had prescribed him anxiety medicine because he has like anger issues and stuff, and he went too far, ended up killing Tristan when they were trying to get Andy. But the reason why Andy, because like how Andy became Malcolm's obsession with saving, that was almost him slipping up and almost revealing the fact is that he himself was obsessed with saving Andy, because Malcolm had talked about the fact is every time like he'd ask Malcolm a question, he would never look him in the eye or answer a question or whatever. He wouldn't look him in the eye because he knew that Malcolm, it was legitimately a game between top-notch psychologists knowing like they were reading each other, a battle of wits and psychology back and forth. It was, like I said, it just added this interesting element to it. But the thing is, Andy reminds Simon of the daughter he couldn't save because his daughter actually died because of it. So that adds more hatred he has for Vossler's procedures and stuff like that. In retrospect, it adds more like, oh, why he got even more flustered by it, because, you know, not only being the deprogrammer, but obviously it's like, obviously Malcolm's trauma makes him very good at what he does, and it kind of seems like obviously the same thing applies in Simon's case. But luckily they were able to take him down, and they were able to find Andy and rescue her. So luckily when it was all said and done, it worked out, you know. And I did like at the end, you know, it's like, you know, you have Gil asking Malcolm if he was okay. He was like, because the entire episode he's like, I'm fine. But this time he goes, I'm fine. Stops. And he goes, no, I'm not okay. And for Gil, you know, he's like, actually, that's okay. And Malcolm's like, I don't get that. It's like, the fact is you recognize that you're not okay. And because when you're saying you're okay means that you're not even recognizing the fact that you're not okay. But at least you're able to recognize that. That's at least the first steps to realizing like something's wrong here, that you need to work on something. And he's apologizing to Gil. Like, I didn't mean to. He's like, no, I understand. But I'm wondering, is Gil going to take some of that to be like, honestly, I shouldn't be putting you in this position. But he is telling Malcolm, you definitely need to take like at least 2 weeks off. So, but now Malcolm's going to be kind of trapped with himself. But what's interesting is he sees a little kid version of himself again, but it's not the same murdered version. It's just a little kid version of himself. It's like, I know you're here with me, and you know that was kind of something that's hard for us to kind of process, that our dad wanted us dead. But then his younger self says, but he didn't. Despite all that, our dad didn't kill us. And, you know, the conversation doesn't continue, but the point is to say that that means something. And so I'm curious to see, because at first I was wondering if that's something that Martin had just said, or maybe he really did feel like that. We won't really know until Malcolm and Martin cross paths again to kind of find out about that, whether there's truth to that whole situation or not. But the fact is that he didn't kill Malcolm must mean something, that there is a love there, that despite being the monster he is, there is still a human heart there, you know. So I am very interested to, you know, see where all this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.